Welcome to Sherlock Shadow Channel, where every story hides a secret. Grab your coffee, sit back, and dive into a world of twists and turns. Tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot and the Rose Pressed Between Two Lives. Chapter 1. The Withered Rose. The clock in the lobby of the Armitage Hotel struck 9:15 when Miss Emily Vauquelin descended the marble staircase, her pearl-grey dress brushing the steps like a resigned cloud. Outside, the autumn wind swept dry leaves against the entrance in swirling gusts, and the sky seemed undecided on whether it would rain or not. Inside, however, the stillness of the main hall had an almost funereal quality, perhaps because, indeed, that morning death had made itself present. The body of Mr. Armand Renaud, a retired Parisian publisher and frequent guest at the Armitage, had been found lifeless in his private room, number 6, with a frozen expression of profound bewilderment. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, only the half-open window, an untouched teacup, and on the desk, a pressed rose, dried and carefully framed between two glass panes. A harmless object, and yet so out of place that it seemed to cry out for attention. Miss Vauquelin, a French governess with a rather austere temperament, had been the first to raise the alarm after noticing that Mr. Renaud hadn't come down for his usual breakfast on the sun terrace. She knocked on his door, waited, and finally asked the receptionist for help. What followed was a series of murmurs, discreet knocks, and the arrival of Inspector Fournier, a man of massive build, an uneven moustache, and limited patience. Natural death, perhaps, the inspector murmured upon seeing the body. Or a very refined poison, though the doctor will know that. But what was even more disconcerting than the uncertain cause of death was the discovery of an incomplete letter in the deceased's pocket. A folded sheet of paper, the ink still wet, broke off mid-sentence. If it doesn't arrive before Monday, everything will be. The rest of the paper was blank. Everything will remain what? Fournier said irritably, presenting it as if he had been personally insulted. The other guests, though few, were already murmuring among themselves in the closed dining room. The Italian countess, knitting in the corner without looking up. Monsieur Duvivier, a retired composer who spoke to the waiters more than to his peers, and young Henry Blake, the new British guest with a melancholy air, who had been seen walking alone in the gardens the previous evening. By the time the doctor certified the death as undetermined and the authorities sealed the room, the confusion was complete. The hotel owner, a nervous man named Gérard Marceau, was soon muttering, "This can't stay like this. If someone more capable doesn't come along, someone like that detective, that Belgian." And so, a few hours later, when a Renault taxi parked outside the Armitage, the driver got out, opened the rear door with a theatrical bow, and out emerged a short man with an immaculate moustache, a silver-handled walking stick, and a suitcase that looked too polished to be real. Hercule Poirot, Europe's most celebrated private detective, had arrived. "Messieurs et mesdames," he said with a slight nod as he crossed the threshold. "Duty calls, and circumstances interest me." He was greeted with a mixture of relief and reluctance. Fournier, visibly sceptical, muttered, "It's not a confirmed murder. It could still be natural." Poirot narrowed his eyes. A pressed rose, an unfinished letter, and a face frozen on the threshold of astonishment. "And you're talking to me about something natural, Inspector?" Settled into one of the hotel's private rooms overlooking the autumn garden, Poirot requested only one thing before beginning: silence. He closed his eyes, as if he could reconstruct the scene without seeing it. Then, upon opening them, he asked to speak to Mademoiselle Vauquelin first. She walked in stiffly, as if she were on trial. "Has Mr. Renaud been in distress recently?" asked Poirot. "More like a pensive person," he replied. He would spend hours staring out the window, holding the rose in his hands. He would touch it, as if he wanted it to come back to life. "And did you have visitors?" "Just correspondence. And a few days ago a woman came looking for him. She didn't tell me her name. Blonde, thin, she never came back." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And what did you think of the rose?" "Too intact for something so old, as if it couldn't leave." Poirot nodded slowly, taking notes not on paper, but in his little grey cells. Then he asked to see the letter. He observed the strokes, the break in the ink, the space where the sentence hung like a broken breath. "Everything will remain," he repeated in a low voice. "Nothing is as disturbing as what is left unsaid." He then walked toward room 6. On the desk, the rose was still there. Between two panes of glass, without flower or fragrance, but as if caught between two times. Poirot inclined his head. A rose, pressed between two lives. The mystery, he thought, was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Web of the Inner Garden. The morning after his arrival, Hercule Poirot appeared on the terrace of the Armitage Hotel's inner garden at 8 o'clock sharp. He wore beige suede gloves, a neatly folded handkerchief in his breast pocket, and had a sharp gaze. He sat down at the wrought-iron table next to the climbing rose bush, whose flowers seemed to observe him with the same intensity with which he examined his surroundings. "A well-woven web," he murmured, his gaze falling over the scattered group of guests. "But who's the spider? And who thinks he's the fly?" They served him perfectly prepared tea, which he examined before drinking as if suspicious of every leaf. Then Inspector Fournier arrived, still in a bad mood, his trench coat unbuttoned and an unlit cigar in his hand. "Will you begin your interrogations today, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, my friend. Today I'm starting with observation. Then the questions will come. We don't have time for philosophical games." "Oh, but time always takes the wrong shape when you chase it. Look at Mr. Duvivier, for example." The retired composer stood at the opposite end of the garden, fingering an invisible melody on the table. His eyes flickered with a restlessness that belied his apparent calm. "He's played the same sequence of fingers 3 times, Poirot pointed out. "An obsession, perhaps, or guilt." "Or simply senile dementia," scoffed Fournier. Poirot ignored the comment. Then he gently turned his head toward the Italian countess, Signora Belladonna Varsi, who was knitting with slow, graceful movements. Every stitch was perfect, every needle change fluid, and yet her eyes never rested on what she was knitting. "Do you believe, Inspector," said Poirot without looking at him, "that someone can sew the fabric of a lie without ever looking at the thread?" Fournier let out an impatient grunt. "Do you want me to call the guests one by one, or are you going to continue philosophizing while the corpse cools?" Poirot smiled. "Oh, he's been cold since before he died. But yes, call them. Let's start with the young Englishman, Monsieur Blake." Henry Blake arrived shortly after, dressed in a tweed jacket, his eyes slightly red-rimmed. He had the air of someone who hasn't slept well but doesn't want to appear weak. "Thank you for coming, monsieur," Poirot said politely. "I wish to understand, not accuse. Let's begin with your relationship with Monsieur Renaud." Blake sat down and crossed his arms. "I had no relationship with him. I barely said hello twice. I arrived a week ago to write in peace, that's all." And the night before his death. I was in the garden, yes, I was strolling. My head was all wrapped up in my manuscript. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Is the manuscript a novel? A play, tragic, although now it's starting to seem more like a comedy to me. Poirot inclined his head. And the rose? Did you ever think you saw it with him? No, she hesitated. Although once, in the hall, I saw him with a frame. I thought it was a photograph. I never imagined. What would a dead flower be? Blake shuddered. Poirot smiled slightly. Thank you, sir. That's enough for now. When the young man left, Fournier jotted something down in his notebook with a forced gesture. Suspicious? Everyone is, until someone lies where they don't need to. Next up was the governess, Miss Emily Vauquelin, who reappeared with her stern demeanor and rigid hands in her lap. Her dark dress smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. Miss Vauquelin, Poirot began in a friendly tone, were you familiar with Monsieur Renault's letter-writing habits? I used to write often, especially in the evenings. I didn't allow any interruptions while I was doing so. Have you ever dictated a letter to him? Never. He was very jealous of his privacy. And the night before he died, did you see him? Only when he went up to his room after dinner. He was in a bad mood, I'd say. He refused dessert and asked not to be disturbed. Did he mention anyone? Number. But as he passed my table, he murmured, "Tomorrow it will all be over, finally." Poirot raised an eyebrow. Did he say it out loud? Loud enough for me to hear, yes. And your impression of him as a person? Reserved, but courteous. Although there was sadness in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of sadness born of the present, but of something he'd never fully understood. Thank you, miss. She walked away like a Swiss watch, without losing the rhythm of her steps. The third interview was with Countess Vassy. She entered as if attending an opera, dressed in an embroidered kimono and with an expression of elegant tolerance. As she sat down, she dropped her shawl as if to begin an act. Signora Varsy, I appreciate your time, said Poirot. Were you in any way related to Monsieur Renault? Just civilized encounters. We exchanged greetings and smiles. That's no small feat these days. Did he seem like a happy man to you? Oh no. He looked like someone who was expecting something, or fearing something. Sometimes he looked at his watch as if he expected it to show a different minute than the one it actually showed. And the pressed rose? I've never seen it. But if someone keeps a dead flower, either they haven't gotten over the past, or they want someone to know. What do you think is more likely? She smiled, without answering. Signora, did you see any strange women visit the hotel this week? His lips contracted in a brief grimace. I saw many women, monsieur. Some beautiful, some vulgar. What do you want me to remember? A thin, blonde woman. The Countess remained thoughtful. A young blonde arrived one afternoon. She didn't stay. She waited in the lobby, but when Monsieur Renault didn't come down, she left. She was wearing a pale blue coat. She was smoking nervously. Did you tell anyone your name? Number. But there was an old postcard in her purse that she dropped. I gave it back to her. I saw the picture, a rose garden. Poirot leaned forward, interested. Did you recognize her? Maybe. It looked like a painting. Why would a woman bring that with her if not out of nostalgia or warning? When the Countess left, Fournier sighed. We have nothing concrete, just ghosts and metaphors. Ah, but ghosts, Inspector, tend to live in the corners of the truth. Poirot stood up and walked slowly toward the rosebush in the inner garden. He took one of the dried stems between his fingers, as if gauging her grief. A postcard with a rose garden, a pressed rose, an unfinished sentence, a woman nervously smoking, and a man saying, "Tomorrow it will all be over." He turned to the inspector. "Do you see, my friend, how the outline is beginning to take shape?" "No," Fournier replied, annoyed. "I see a maze." "Exactly, and every labyrinth has an entrance. We just crossed it." Poirot walked towards his room, but before disappearing he murmured, "A garden doesn't bloom without roots, and this story has its roots buried deep." Chapter 3. The Mirror of Absences. The third day dawned with a thick mist drifting through the windows of the Armitage Hotel like a whisper. The interior garden, usually bathed in the slanting light of the autumn sun, now resembled a faded painting. The cast-iron chairs were covered in dew, and the flowers hung with a melancholy languor, as if sharing a secret. Poirot got up early. He had slept little, restless, not from anxiety but from anticipation. The pieces were beginning to move, although they weren't yet in their places. Like an experienced chess player, he wouldn't move his queen until all the pawns had revealed their intention. At 8:30, he went down to the dining room. He carefully observed the absences more than the presences. Miss Vauquelin was already in her usual place, sipping her black coffee without sugar, and Countess Varsi was leafing through an Italian newspaper without paying any real attention to him. Inspector Fournier was still gone, and neither was young Blake. Poirot frowned slightly, not at the absence but at the opportunity it presented. He approached the maître d'. "Excuse me, sir. Have you seen Mr. Blake this morning?" The maître d', a neat and discreet man, bowed his head. "No, Monsieur Poirot. Your breakfast has not yet been ordered, and your room has not responded to service. Could you please check?" A few minutes later, a young waiter returned, pale. "Mr. Blake isn't in his room, monsieur. His bed is made, as if he hadn't slept there, but his suitcase is still there. So is his typewriter." Poirot nodded slowly. "Thanks." It was then that Fournier arrived, more dishevelled than usual. "What's going on now?" he said, noticing the commotion. "Monsieur Blake didn't sleep in his bed last night," said Poirot. "And according to the waiter, no one has seen him since last night." "Did he run away?" "We don't know. But leaving a room with your personal belongings intact, that's not running away, it's interrupting." They went up together to Henry Blake's room. It was tidy, too tidy. The typewriter was covered with a black cloth, and in the waste-paper basket, carefully crumpled, lay a sheet of paper with an incomplete paragraph. "A man may kill for love, but he only lies out of shame." Poirot lifted the paper with tongs, read it silently, and then placed it delicately on the table. "It's not part of the work. It's raw thought. Perhaps confession." "Or pulp fiction," Fournier said, crossing his arms. "Why would it disappear now?" Poirot approached the wardrobe. Inside, the suits hung in meticulous order. At the bottom, however, he found a small leather case. He opened it. "An album," he said. "Photographs." He slowly flipped through the pages, mostly landscapes, beaches, gardens, old buildings. Then portraits. A smiling blonde woman with a mole next to her left eye. In several images she appeared with Henry. In others she appeared alone, in the same rose garden seen in the postcard described by the Countess. Poirot removed a photograph. On the back, in curved handwriting, it read, "You said nothing would ever wither, but I did." Fournier approached, read, and cursed under his breath. A scorned woman. Poirot carefully put the photos away. Or a remembered woman. The important thing isn't who wrote this, but why he kept it. So now we have a dead flower, a forgotten woman, and a disappearing man. Coincidence? Coincidences, Inspector, are fate's way of disguising its craftsmanship. Back in the lobby, Poirot noticed a subtle movement. Miss Vauquelin was talking discreetly to one of the waiters. When she saw him approaching, she fell silent. "Mademoiselle," he said politely, "have you noticed anything strange this morning?" "Strange?" he replied, his expression seemingly rehearsed. "Just the weather and the tension. Were you affected by the disappearance of young Blake?" She tensed slightly. "I didn't know him well." "But you were watching him?" She hesitated. "I saw him leave last night. Around 11. He was heading toward the back of the hotel, along the path that leads to the greenhouse." "Alone?" "Yes, although it seemed, how do I put it, like he was hesitant to go. He was looking back." "And you didn't think about saying it?" "Not until now. He didn't seem dangerous, just restless." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, mademoiselle. It has been helpful." Later, Poirot asked for the keys to the old greenhouse, a glass and rusty iron structure at the end of the back garden. No one had used it for years, but it remained covered in moss and dried leaves, like a forgotten reliquary. Upon arriving, he immediately noticed that one of the doors was unlocked. He entered slowly, with Fournier following behind him. The air smelled of dampness and ancient earth. In a corner, almost overgrown with weeds, sat a folding chair with a coat on it. "It's Blake's," Fournier said as he touched it. Poirot bent down. On the floor, between the cracked tiles, something barely stood out. He scraped the dirt with a handkerchief and extracted a folded sheet of paper. It was a letter. The ink was smudged with moisture, but it was still legible. I couldn't destroy it. Not the rose. Not what it means. I thought hiding it would be enough. But it found me. It always finds. Fournier crossed himself. "Are you referring to the woman, or to the guilt?" "Perhaps both," said Poirot, surveying the place. "Guilt is a persistent scent, Inspector. It doesn't disappear. It just blends with its surroundings." "And where is he now?" Poirot examined the surroundings. Nothing more. But as he stepped outside, he looked toward the nearest tree. On a low branch, barely visible among the leaves, someone had hung a blue ribbon, the same shade as the coat of the woman described by the Countess. "A trail," he murmured, "not to guide us, but to challenge us." That night, the hotel was quieter than usual. Even the Countess abandoned her knitting. Murmurs multiplied. Some believed Blake had committed suicide, others that he had fled from a crime, and the oldest spoke of lovers returning from the past to collect what was owed to them. Poirot dined alone. Then he went up to his room and placed the key objects on the table. The pressed rose, the unfinished letter, the photograph of the blonde woman, the blue ribbon rescued from the tree, and the letter found in the greenhouse. He arranged them like pieces of a puzzle. A flower, an interrupted sentence, a stored memory, a hidden fear, and now an absence. He approached the window. He looked out at the garden, where the greenhouse lay like a glass sarcophagus. Monsieur Blake. He didn't run away. He was torn away, or he hid from what he couldn't face. He turned to his suitcase and pulled out a notebook. "Tomorrow I'll speak to the waiter, the one who spoke to Miss Vauquelin." He saw something, or heard something. And then the Countess. She knows more than she's letting on. Poirot closed the notebook, and, as he turned off the lamp, he murmured, "When someone disappears, it's often because they can no longer sustain the story they invented." Chapter 4. The Shadows That Repeat Your Name. The next morning, an even thicker fog enveloped the foundations of the Armitage Hotel. From his window, Poirot watched as the mist slowly absorbed the statues in the garden, turning them into stone ghosts. It was as if the past itself had condensed into vapor, refusing to dissipate until the truth was brought back into the light. He dressed with care, an embroidered waistcoat, a perfectly knotted tie, and a fabric rose, not pressed but vivid in texture, pinned to his buttonhole. Before going down to the dining room, he jotted a sentence in his notebook. No one disappears without leaving a mark. But sometimes the mark isn't on the ground, but on others. In the dining room, the atmosphere was more sombre than ever. Mademoiselle Vauquelin was stirring her coffee without drinking it. Countess Varsi had put down her sewing and was leafing through a novel without going past the first page. Inspector Fournier arrived with a tense expression, a crumpled newspaper under his arm. "Nothing from young Blake," he said, sitting down without saying hello. "No one's seen him. He didn't go out the front door either, and the back garden wall is too high to climb without help." Poirot sipped his tea, unfazed. "Then he's still here." "Here?" "Or what this place represents to him. Not every hiding place is physical, Inspector. Don't start with your Belgian poetry again." Poirot ignored him and turned to the young waiter, Henri, who was passing by their table. "Just a moment, please," he said. "May I ask you a question?" The waiter stopped immediately, nervous. He had dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands. "Claro, sir. You spoke with Miss Vauquelin yesterday, yes?" "Yes, sir. She asked me if anyone had seen Monsieur Blake leave the night before." "And what did you answer?" "I told you I didn't see him leave, but—" She lowered her voice. "I did see him come down the stairs shortly before midnight. He didn't use the front door but the back hallway. He had an envelope in his hand." "An envelope?" "Large, as if it contained papers. He walked as if he were carrying something important." "And then?" "Nothing else. The night shift started right then, and I left." Poirot bowed his thanks. "Inspector," he said, turning around, "is there a record of the hotel's lost property?" "That? The laundry, the hotel linen room, the place where they take what guests leave in the hallways, what falls out of pockets, what no one claims." Minutes later, Poirot and Fournier descended a narrow back staircase leading to the cellar. The air was damp and smelled of old soap and steamed linen. The head laundry manager, a plump, sharp-eyed woman named Madame Leontine, greeted them curiously. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, there's a box for lost property. Are you looking for anything in particular?" "I won't know until I see it." He opened the box. It contained handkerchiefs, loose earrings, a gentleman's glove, and a broken comb. Poirot rummaged delicately until he found what he was looking for, a small, feminine-looking, unlocked red leather diary. When he opened it, he found several torn pages, but also a dated page. "October 3rd. He told me he wouldn't remember me again, but here I am, pressed between the leaves of his life like a scentless flower. Armand can't deny what he was. I can't deny what I am." "Armand?" Fournier asked. Poirot nodded. "Armand Renaud. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the handwriting of the woman in the photograph, the blonde woman, the one with the mole next to her eye, and the one in the blue coat." "How did this get into the laundry?" "That, my friend, is an excellent question." They returned to the hall. Poirot asked to speak to Countess Varsi again. She arrived with a look of theatrical annoyance, as if the investigation were a minor inconvenience in her schedule of silent intrigues. "Signora," said Poirot, "could you describe to me again the woman you saw coming to fetch Monsieur Renaud?" "I already did. Blonde, slim. She had a way of walking, as if the ground owed her something. Would you recognize his face?" "Probably. I have a good memory for faces, especially those that pretend they have no past." Poirot placed the photograph he had taken from Blake's album on the table. The Countess looked at it for a second, and then lowered her eyes. "Yes, it's her. Do you know who he is?" "Number. But I saw that same face years ago, in a provincial theatre. She was an actress, I think. One of those who plays wounded women easily. Do you remember your name?" "Number. But she used a pseudonym, something floral." Poirot murmured, "Camellia, Violet, number Rosa," she said, as if plucking it from a forgotten corner. She called herself Rosa Le Maire. "Thank you, Signora. It was revealing." Back in his room, Poirot spread out on the bed the pieces he had collected so far. Renaud's incomplete letter, the rose pressed between glass, Rosa Le Maire's photograph, the diary found in the laundry, and Blake's note. They were all speaking, but in fragmented voices. "She sought him out," Poirot murmured. "He rejected her. Blake knew her, and now she's disappeared. Out of guilt, out of protection." He took his notebook and wrote, "Rosa Le Maire, stage name." He met Renaud years ago, allegedly romantic relationship. He comes back and confronts him. Blake knows her too. Personal link disappears after Renaud's death. Poirot looked up. The puzzle already had a border. Now it was a matter of filling in the center. That night, while the hotel was asleep, Poirot went down to the garden once more. He had Rosa's photograph with him, which he left next to the blue ribbon still tied to the tree. And he waited. He waited like someone listening to an echo return from a distant mountain. At 11 o'clock sharp, she heard soft footsteps on the gravel. A figure approached from the shadow of the hedge. She was slim, wearing a long coat and a hat that hid her face. She stopped when she saw Poirot's silhouette, motionless by the tree. "Did you love her?" Poirot asked without turning around. "Or did you just feel responsible?" The figure stepped back. "Henry Blake, if you still have an ounce of truth in you, I ask you not to disappear into lies." Silence. But the figure did not flee. Poirot turned. "She's back, right? Rosa Le Maire is at the hotel or nearby." Blake took off his hat. He was pale, aged by 2 days of absence. "I can't protect her anymore." "Nor should you. But tell me, who wants her dead?" "I don't know. But she wasn't the one who killed Renaud." "And you?" Blake looked down. "I saw things. I heard more. But not the truth. Not yet." Poirot approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, Monsieur Blake. We shall know everything." Chapter 5. The Lie I Didn't Know I Was Lying To. The morning after Henry Blake's silent return brought a strange air to the Armitage Hotel, as if the building itself had held its breath during the night and was now finally exhaling with suspicion. The mist had cleared, but an ashy grey still covered the walls, as if the mystery within them refused to dissipate with the light of day. Poirot descended into the main drawing-room earlier than usual. His gait was calm, but his gaze swept the surroundings with the precision of a jeweller examining a diamond, looking for imperfections that others miss. As he passed, Miss Vauclin stopped dead in her tracks. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his lips tightening. "Someone slipped this under my door this morning." He held out a piece of paper folded in 4. The Belgian took it with gloves and unfolded it. In clumsy capital letters, drawn with a shaky black pen, it read, "Stop asking questions or you'll be the next withered flower. Poirot stared at her. "Who do you think this warning is directed at, mademoiselle? You or me?" "I don't know," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But it worries me. And rightly so. A threat, no matter how cowardly, is never innocent." He immediately called Inspector Fournier. The gendarme showed up shortly afterward, his usual mixture of irritation and weariness. "Threats now, as if we didn't have enough with a dead man, a ghost woman, and a fugitive writer." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Blake's back. This morning. I saw him. He's in his room right now." Fournier blinked. "And you didn't take it?" "Not yet, because I suspect this crime doesn't have a single culprit, but rather multiple hands that wove it like a web. Removing him now would be pulling the thread before its time." The inspector frowned, but remained silent. Poirot turned back to Vauquelin. "Can you think of anyone who would benefit if you remained silent?" "I have no enemies," she said, with defensive harshness. "No secrets. I have dedicated my life to service and order. I am not a threat to anyone." Poirot watched her for a long moment. "The most dangerous people aren't always those with secrets, but those who accidentally touch other people's secrets." While Fournier was busy sending the note for handwriting analysis, more out of procedure than hope, Poirot went up to Henry Blake's room. He knocked softly. The door opened slightly. Blake looked haggard but dressed and standing. His expression was a mixture of relief and resignation. "I didn't go far," he said before Poirot could speak. "I slept in the greenhouse. I had nowhere else to go. The past is often a labyrinth with no exits, monsieur, but hiding in it doesn't make it any less dangerous. Please tell me the truth. Did you know Rosa Lemaire?" Blake sat down. "Yes. I met her 4 years ago. She was in the cast of a small play I wrote in Lyon. It was a disaster, but she was intense, hurt inside. We had something for a while. Then she disappeared." "And he came back?" "A month ago I received a letter from him. He said he'd seen my name in the newspaper in connection with a literary scholarship, that he was in France, that he needed to talk to me. He didn't reply to my letters, but he came. He followed me here. He gave me that pressed rose, the same one that's now in everyone's hands." Poirot nodded. "And you gave her to Renaud?" "Number, he had it. I didn't give it to him. That's the strange thing. I kept it in my diary, but it disappeared." Poirot approached. "Could you swear that you didn't put it on Renaud's desk?" "I swear." "So someone else took it from you? Someone who wanted to intertwine the stories or confuse them?" Blake lowered his voice. "Rosa told me she knew Renaud, that he had loved her and destroyed her, that he had promised her a future and then abandoned her. She said she had come for a resolution. Resolution or revenge? I don't know. She was upset. She wasn't the same person I remembered." Poirot studied him carefully. "And you haven't seen her since then?" "Number. Which means, Mr. Blake, that he could still be here, among us." Mid-morning, Poirot again requested access to Armand Renaud's room. This time he asked to be alone. He walked around the place slowly, memorizing every corner. On the bureau, he found a small wooden box with a forced lock. Inside, torn letters. He rearranged them like an emotional puzzle. Disjointed sentences, but enough. "You can't hide me forever. I am the consequence of your silence. The rose was our promise. You shouldn't have buried it alive. Your name no longer scares me, but my absence should." Poirot closed his eyes. "She didn't come to kill him," he murmured. "She came to force him to remember, but someone else couldn't bear what that would mean. He turned to the desk where the rose had been, and stopped. He wasn't there. The glass frame was gone. Poirot pursed his lips. He immediately summoned Fournier and the hotel owner, Gérard Marceau. "Who has access to this room since the lockdown?" "Just me," Marceau said, "and the inspector." "And did you move anything?" "Number the Rose was there last night, I remember it well. Some guests asked me for it, they wanted to see it, as if it were a trophy." "Who asked for it?" "The Countess, also Mademoiselle Vauquelin, and young Duvivier, the composer, but they only looked at her from the doorway. No one came in." "And this morning?" "There's been no activity here, I swear." Poirot looked up thoughtfully. So someone lied, or someone waited for others to stop looking. Shortly after, he asked to see Monsieur Duvivier privately. The old man arrived wearing his usual velvet waistcoat and his gliding gait. His fingers moved as if playing an invisible piano, even as he walked. "Do you enjoy roses, Monsieur Duvivier?" The old man smiled. "Not in vases, but in poetry, yes, although wilted flowers depress me." "And did Mr. Renault's pressed rose depress you?" "It intrigued me, because you know there are flowers that die and others that pretend to be dead." Poirot didn't reply immediately. Then he changed his focus. "Have you ever met an actress named Rosa Lemaire?" Duvivier's fingers stopped for the first time. "That name? A long time ago. In Marseille, perhaps, at a reading of Lorca, a woman with a voice that seemed to hurt her." "Did you see her again?" "Number. But sometimes when the shadows lengthen, I think I hear her in the hallways, as if the hotel, old as it is, remembers more than its guests." Returning to the dining room, Poirot met Fournier, who had an even more serious expression. "The rose has been found," she said. "It was in the laundry basket, wrapped in a scented handkerchief. Someone tried to hide it among towels on the 3rd floor." "And who does the handkerchief belong to?" Fournier swallowed. "It is embroidered with a V." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. "Vauquelin, O stem." "Which of the two?" Poirot opened his eyes, shining. "That, my friend, we'll find out tonight." Chapter 6. The woman who had already been here. Night had fallen over the Armitage Hotel like a thick ceremonial curtain. The wind outside rustled against the windows with a sustained moan, as if the building itself were trying to warn that something was approaching. Inside, the corridors felt longer, the lamps dimmer, and the silences heavier. It was the kind of night when ghosts didn't need to appear. What memory didn't yet dare to say was enough. Poirot had called a discreet meeting in the reading room, a rarely visited room in the hotel, decorated with antique tapestries and a dormant fireplace. Waiting there, in various states of discomfort, were 4 key figures. Mademoiselle Vauquelin, as erect as a wax figure, Countess Varcy, leafing through a magazine without reading it, Inspector Fournier, impatiently rubbing his temples, and Henry Blake, staring at the floor. Poirot finally entered, his stride calm, a leather briefcase under his arm. He stopped in the middle of the room and spoke with a gentleness that contrasted with the tension in the air. "My friends, I haven't asked for your presence tonight to accuse anyone, not yet, but certain details must be clarified before the truth can be fully revealed." He first addressed Miss Vauquelin. "Mademoiselle, can you explain how a handkerchief embroidered with your initial ended up wrapping a pressed rose in a laundry basket on the 3rd floor?" She blinked, tense. "I don't know. First period. I had handkerchiefs like that, of course, but I'm not missing any." "Do you keep them in your room?" "Yeah. And your door was locked these days?" "Always." Poirot nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. He then turned to the Countess. Signora Varsi, do you also embroider your personal clothes? She raised an eyebrow, irritated. Of course not. My initials are engraved in silver, not embroidered on linen. So, the handkerchief isn't yours, nor Monsieur Blake's, we know that. That narrows the options. But more important than the handkerchief is what it was wrapped in. The rose. That withered flower that someone didn't want us to see anymore. Fournier finally spoke. Why hide it now? Poirot raised a finger. Because the rose, Inspector, is more than an object. It's a threat, a symbol. And for someone here, a confession that shouldn't have existed. He turned to Blake. Monsieur, in your story you mentioned that Rosa Lemaire gave you that flower. But you also said that it disappeared afterward. Are you sure you haven't seen it since then? Blake nodded uncertainly. I would be, if it weren't for the fact that today, as I was going down the service stairs, I saw a shadow on the second floor. Tall, thin, and with that gait I knew. It looked like her, but it disappeared before I could call her name. And he recognized her? Not quite, but I felt like... He hesitated. It was as if the past had returned on its own. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and spoke without theatricality. Because he's back. The silence that followed was absolute. Poirot placed his folder on the table, opened it, and revealed a recent photograph. It was the same woman from the old pictures, but more gaunt. Her eyes were still intense, but now framed by years of wear. The mole next to her eye was still there. Rosa Lemaire is in town. She was located this afternoon by one of Inspector Fournier's officers after a brief visit to the pharmacy. She checked into a boarding house 3 blocks from here under a false name. The Countess was the first to speak. And why did he come back? Why didn't he show up? Poirot looked at her gravely. Because he's afraid, and when fear mixes with love, what you get isn't courage, but silence. An hour later, in a private room at the hotel, Poirot received Rosa Lemaire. She was wrapped in a blue coat that had already lost its original color. Her face was pale, but her posture was firm. She wore the broken dignity of someone who has fought hard to remain royal. Mademoiselle, said Poirot, with grave courtesy, thank you for coming. I had no choice, did I? There always is, but sometimes it's between 2 evils. She sat down. She didn't ask for tea or water. Her hands remained clasped together as if in an ancient prayer. I didn't kill Armand Renault, he said without preamble, if that's what you want to know. I believe that. But there are things you do know, and you haven't said them yet. She sighed. I loved him. At a time when all he could do was hide me. I was a rising actress, and he was a prestigious man with a family who would never accept me. He promised me freedom. Then he erased me. But he couldn't let go of me completely. He sent me letters, poems, money. For how long? Years. Until I grew tired of being an embarrassing memory. Then I disappeared. I reinvented myself. And why come back now? Because I got a letter from him 3 weeks ago. He said he was sick, that he wanted to see me one last time, that the rose was still our promise. Poirot bowed. Can you show me that letter? She nodded. She took a battered envelope from her bag. Poirot examined it. The handwriting matched Mr. Renault's, but something didn't add up. The ink, the date. This was written 2 days before his death, he murmured. Yes, I came, but he never saw me. They told me he was feeling unwell. I left the rose, and I left. Where did you leave it? With a young man, on the terrace. He had a notebook. His hair was messy. I think he was the writer. Poirot nodded. Slowly. Henry Blake. The next morning, Poirot gathered the people involved again, but this time there was no drama, just clarity. The mystery is beginning to unravel, he said. The rose was given not as a threat, but as closure. But someone saw something else in it, an opportunity, a trap, or a risk to be eliminated. He looked at everyone intensely. The rose moved hands several times. It passed from Rosa to Blake, then disappeared, to reappear with Renaud, and then shrouded in a secret. Who placed it on his desk? Who knew Rosa had returned and wanted to prevent Renaud from seeing it? There was a dense silence. Poirot took one last photograph of the folder. It was of the laundry basket, but not the handkerchief. Rather, it was of the lining of a stained towel, with a small, perfectly symmetrical lipstick smear. "Only one of you wears that shade of lipstick," said Poirot, looking directly at Miss Vauquelin. She paled. "What are you implying? Not that you killed. Not yet. But you did know what the rose meant, that you feared what it would reveal. Maybe not for yourself, but for someone you were protecting." And without waiting for an answer, he added, "Tonight, mes amis, the past can hide no longer. Tomorrow, I'll gather everyone in the living room, and then, as always, the pieces will fall into place." Chapter 7. The Truth That Could Only Be Heard in Silence. The grandfather clock in the lobby of the Armitage Hotel struck 4 in the morning, when a dull thud echoed from the east wing. It wasn't a scream or a bang, but the sharp sound of a door slamming shut, as if someone had fled from something more intangible than fear. Themselves. Poirot, always a light sleeper, sat up in his bed. He had slept with his waistcoat on, as if even in his dreams he demanded order. In less than 3 minutes he was descending the stairs, cane in hand, moustache neat, and a thought throbbing beneath his brow. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it locks itself away. In the East Wing corridor, the door to room 14 was ajar. It was Miss Emily Vauquelin's room. Poirot approached, knocked discreetly. "Mademoiselle, are you okay?" No response. He came in. The bedside lamp was on, casting a warm glow over the empty bed. On the rug, an envelope, and on the desk a yellow-page notebook tied with a ribbon. The rest was in perfect order. Poirot took the envelope. It bore his name written in the governess's tight, precise handwriting. He opened it. "Mr. Poirot, I can't take it any more. I'm not who everyone thinks I am. I didn't kill Armand, but I did bury part of his truth. My silence is now a form of lie. You'll see. You'll know. I've left what's necessary in the notebook. Don't look for me. I didn't run away out of fear, but out of compassion." Evie Poirot read the letter 3 times. Then he took out the notebook with the ribbon. It was a diary. At 6 in the morning, Inspector Fournier found him sitting by the reading room window, the newspaper in his hands, and his face bent like a sculpture in concentration. "Missing?" "Yes," said Poirot, "but not out of guilt. Not the kind you imagine." "Did you take luggage?" "Just a bag, nothing else." "And so?" Poirot picked up the diary. A story and a mirror. Fournier frowned. "Well?" Poirot slowly closed the notebook. "Miss Emily Vauquelin is not, and never was, a simple retired governess." "What are you saying?" "Her real name is Emilienne Vauquelin Renaud, half-sister of the late Armand Renaud. Children of the same father, but different mothers. Raised apart, ignored by social circles, and for years, hidden from each other." "And how did you find out?" Poirot showed him the front page of the diary, an entry dated 5 years earlier. I ran into him today. He didn't recognize me, of course. How could he? I was just a photograph in a forbidden drawer. But I watched him, and I knew he was my brother, not because of what he said, but because of the way he kept quiet. She knew, said Poirot, and she sought him out. She settled here when he retired to the hotel. She feigned an ordinary life, when what she wanted was to be close, though he would never know why. And when Rosa reappeared, he feared that the story she wished to close would open a wound that never healed. And then? He didn't kill her. He didn't kill anyone. But he hid the rose, yes. And possibly she was the one who slipped the letter into his pocket to preserve the aura of mystery, to ensure the story remained, suspended, incomplete. An absurd gesture, but one laden with unrequited love. And the disappearance, an act of liberation, perhaps of shame, of not having been able to face it, of having been so close, without ever having been seen. Fournier leaned back in the chair. And the crime? Do you still think there's one? Poirot sat up slowly. Oh yes, because Armand Renaud didn't die of natural causes, and someone here is still lying, not out of fear, but out of calculation. At 9 o'clock sharp, Poirot summoned the rest of the guests to the drawing room. Countess Varsy arrived first, perfumed and expressionless. Henry Blake entered next, nervous, his fingers stained with ink. Rosa Lemaire, whom Poirot had discreetly accommodated in a room next to his, arrived wrapped in a grey scarf, her eyes fixed on the floor. Poirot stood up. My friends, we are close, very close. Last night, Miss Vauclin left, not out of guilt, but out of truth. In her diary, she left testimony of her blood, of her brotherhood with Armand, and of her fear that the past would devour him again. But she didn't kill him. She had no reason. On the contrary, her silence was her way of loving. He turned to Rosa. Mademoiselle Lemaire, you didn't want revenge, only farewell. But unknowingly, you handed over the key that activated the final mechanism. The rose, the symbol of a story never resolved. He turned to Blake. And you, monsieur, you were the catalyst. The rose passed through your hands. It disappeared from your diary. It appeared with Renaud, and you never knew how. But someone did. Poirot looked at Countess Varsy. Signora, could you tell us what your relationship with Armand Renaud was really like? She looked up, cold. I didn't have any. That's not true. Poirot took from his pocket an old, yellowed clipping he had found at the bottom of Emilienne's diary. A social note from 12 years ago. During the gala dinner at the Théâtre National, editor Armand Renaud was seen chatting animatedly with retired actress Belladonna Varsy, whose stage career seems far from over. Will she deny that she was an actress? She hesitated, and in that silence, she said it all. It was an adventure, he said finally. Brief, but not trivial. And Rosa Lemaire, did you know her? Yes, I saw her in the dressing room, an insecure girl full of fire. Armand was infatuated with her. I was an ornament. She, his fire. Poirot nodded slowly. And that hurt you? Much more than I imagined. But not out of jealousy. Because of what it revealed in me, the expiration of my life. And then? I forgot. I thought I had. But when Rosa returned, when I saw her in the hall, I felt like the past had won. And when I saw the rose on Renaud's desk, I understood that he, too, had wanted to revive what didn't deserve resurrection. Poirot took a step forward. Did you kill him? Number. Did you confront him? Yes. That night, he was drinking. I said things I'd never said before. He told me that Rosa had forgiven him, that she still loved him, that rose was proof that time could remember without revenge. Poirot waited. I left, she said, looking down. He was alive, but broken. I didn't come back. And what happened next? Don't know. Poirot nodded. So, mes amis, there's still one hand missing, one that moved without witnesses, one that was erased with precision, because Armand Renaud was poisoned, not with something crude or vulgar, but with a carefully dosed sedative. And only one person here had access to the medical bottles the hotel keeps for insomniac guests. Fournier raised his head, attentive. Who? Poirot did a final spin, his voice lowered. Someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who seemed to have no story, yet wove it from the margins. Duvivier? Blake asked, puzzled. Precisely. And so, with deliberate slowness, Poirot turned his gaze toward the door. The composer was not in the room. Chapter 8. The Man Who Played Where No One Was Listening. The musical basement of the Hotel Armitage was a forgotten room, colder than the rest of the building, with walls covered in faded velvet and an upright piano occupying the center like a sleeping animal. No one had gone down there for weeks except for Mr. Duvivier. It was his sanctuary, a room that required no conversation, only notes. He spent hours there each evening, his fingers dancing over dusty keys while the entire hotel seemed to forget his existence. But that morning, Hercule Poirot descended the spiral staircase with an expression that was neither severe nor triumphant, but contemplative. He carried a neatly folded white handkerchief, and, in his inside pocket, Emilienne Vauquelin's diary. He didn't expect to find answers in words, but in echoes. Upon arriving, he pushed open the door. It creaked with a soft groan. Inside, the air smelled like a mixture of old paper, varnish, and something else, a subtle, almost imperceptible fragrance. Dried rose. In the corner, sitting in front of the piano, was Duvivier. The old man didn't seem startled, as if he'd been expecting the visit. Monsieur Poirot, he said, without turning around, I'm surprised you didn't come earlier. I knew the right moment would come, and it has. Duvivier slowly lifted his hands from the keyboard, but did not close the lid. And what do you want to know? Poirot took a few steps forward. Not what happened, monsieur, I already know. I want to understand why. Duvivier stood up. He walked to a corner where an old tape recorder rested on a shelf. He pressed a button. The tape began to spin, and a melody emerged, soft, laden with intentional sadness, an unfinished waltz with dissonant chords that seemed to beg for resolution. I wrote this 3 nights ago, he said. It's the last thing I'll ever write. It's called Still Rose. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. He listened not only to the notes, but also to the tremor hidden between them. Did you compose it before or after Renaud's death? Duvivier smiled, without joy, during Poirot approached. You knew him, didn't you? Long before you both met at this hotel. Duvivier nodded. Armand Renaud was more than an editor. He was a filter of lives. I met him 20 years ago when he reviewed one of my piano manuscripts. He said it was brilliant, but it didn't sell. He asked me to write something lighter. I did. I sold, but it was no longer mine. And Rosa, I knew her too. Not in person, but she haunted me. I saw her perform twice. Her sadness was so genuine it couldn't be faked. Renaud spoke of her as one might speak of a novel he never dared to publish. The pressed rose was her symbol, a flower that doesn't wither, but doesn't bloom either. Poirot folded his arms, listening. When she returned, Duvivier continued, and I learned he was planning to reunite with her. I understood that everything in his life was going to fall into place again, that he would have closure, redemption. And you couldn't stand it? Duvivier lowered his gaze. I've lived a life without any music of my own, always following others, correcting other people's scores. Armand. I had the privilege of leaving something incomplete and still being loved. That didn't seem fair to me. Poirot spoke slowly. So she waited until he was alone. She mixed a dose of sedative into his nighttime infusion, a non-violent poison that simply stopped his heart. Yes, Duvivier whispered, and when I saw him die with the rose before him, I knew he had composed his last work. And what did you hope to achieve? Silence, he replied. The only one I was never given. He would forever have an incomplete story, like all of mine. Poirot remained silent for a long time. Then he walked over to the tape recorder and stopped the tape. You know, sir, the most honest music isn't in the notes. It's in the space between them, in what one is afraid to say. Duvivier nodded, resigned. Will you call the police? They're here. Fournier appeared on the threshold, accompanied by 2 officers. The old man offered no resistance. He asked for only one thing. Let the tape play when they take me. That's all. And so it was. As he was escorted down the corridor, the unfinished waltz played for the last time in the music room, and some swear that for a few seconds the entire hotel seemed to stop and listen. Later, in the empty drawing room, Poirot met with Blake, Rosa, and the Countess. The atmosphere was different. No more questions, no more masks. The crime has been solved, said Poirot, but not the pain. That will remain here, within these walls, for a while. And Miss Vauquelin? Rosa asked. I left her a letter, Poirot replied, in which I didn't accuse her but freed her. Perhaps she'll come back, perhaps not. But she's no longer carrying a lie. Blake took a deep breath, as if he could finally do it. And the rose? Poirot smiled slightly. I've asked that it be kept in the greenhouse. Not as evidence, but as a memory. Rosa looked down. She murmured, He once wrote to me, Some flowers live only in memories, because the present would hurt them. Poirot nodded. And yet, mademoiselle, you're still here. That means there are still petals that haven't fallen. That night, the Armitage Hotel was quieter than ever, but it was not a silence of fear. It was one of those that follow a symphony when the last note fades away and you still don't want to applaud. A silence, full of life. Chapter 9. The flower that could only wither once. The sky above the Armitage Hotel dawned clear for the first time in a week. The constant grey that had covered the previous days had dissipated, giving way to a pale, fragile blue, as if the world, after the confession, breathed more clearly. The interior garden still retained the scent of the damp night, but rays of sunlight were already filtering through the windows, touching the plants like fingers awakening dormant memories. Poirot walked alone along the gravel path, his hands behind his back, his gaze lowered but alert. Beside him, between the hedges, the greenhouse shone in the sunlight like a crystal locket. Inside, on a wooden shelf, the pressed rose had been delicately placed. It wasn't framed. It wasn't on display. It simply rested between 2 sheets of old paper, like a letter that had never been sent. The detective stopped in front of the greenhouse and, after a few seconds of silence, opened the door. There stood Rosa Lemaire, her face illuminated by the reflections in the glass. She held the rose with her fingertips, not quite touching it, as if she feared that direct contact would disintegrate it. She wore the same faded blue coat, but her posture was different. She was no longer the figure who hid in the corridors. She was a whole woman, though marked by what could never be. "I thought he'd already left," she said, without turning around. "Not without saying goodbye," Poirot replied gently. She nodded, and for a moment, only the crackling of branches could be heard beyond the glass. "I didn't love him like I used to," she said. "Not after everything that happened, but you can't undo a root just because it no longer blooms. He was a promise, and this rose was the oath that that promise was once real." Poirot approached, his steps muffled by the moss growing between the tiles. "Flowers don't lie, mademoiselle, but men do. Do you think he would have wanted to come back to you?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted to know if I still remembered him. And that's almost the same thing." Poirot looked at her for a long time, then pointed to the rose. "Do you know the true value of that flower?" "Which?" "Not that he survived, but someone wanted him to." She turned, and for the first time looked at him directly. "So what now? What do you do with a story that no longer has a future?" Poirot smiled, not with joy, but with tenderness. "She keeps it like she keeps a perfume that's no longer manufactured. She remembers it with moderation, and she lets it go." Later, on the breakfast terrace, Henry Blake waited with a cup of cold coffee in his hands. He didn't write. He didn't speak. He just stared at the horizon, as if he still didn't know what to do with the gaps left by the case. Poirot sat opposite him. "Did you sleep well?" Blake shook his head. "Number, but not out of guilt, out of emptiness." It's a common feeling after the resolution. When the tension recedes, what remains is oneself, and the questions one didn't ask during the fear. Blake sighed. "I didn't think Duvivier was capable. No one thought so, not even him until it happened. Sometimes crimes aren't born of hatred, but of the inability to accept a life that didn't turn out the way they dreamed. And what do I do now?" Poirot raised his cup without drinking. "Write, not about the crime, not about the rose. Write about what you didn't say, about what you felt when you saw that flower for the first time and knew it was a half-buried story." Blake looked at him with sudden understanding. "I do remember that clearly." "Then start there." At the hotel reception, Countess Varsi was signing out with a jewel-like fountain pen. She wore dark gloves, sunglasses, and perfume so faint it was barely a whisper. When she saw Poirot, she gave him a smile that was more resigned than affectionate. "Will we ever meet again, sir?" "Maybe in another story," he said. "Though I hope not with blood." "And Rosa? She'll act again, but not on stage. About her own life." The Countess closed her bag. "So you've won something." "We've all done it," Poirot replied. "Even those we've lost." That afternoon, Poirot packed his things with his usual care. He ironed his handkerchief by hand, lined up his brushes in his suitcase, and left a letter on the hotel's letterhead on the nightstand. "Dear Monsieur Marceau, I would be grateful if you would place the pressed rose in the greenhouse, not as a reminder of the crime, but as a testament to what was not forgotten. Let no one move it. Let no one name it. Let your silence complete the story that others tried to silence. H.P." Before leaving, he went down to the garden one last time. The flowers were beginning to recover after the storm of the previous days. The rose bushes were breathing again. Poirot stopped beside one of them and gently stroked a young, still-closed shoot. "You, my friend, have not yet seen the world," he murmured. Everything awaits you. But I warn you, be careful with promises." He straightened, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the exit. The Armitage Hotel made no noise as the door closed behind it, and the sun, finally, stayed. Chapter 10. The Little Grey Cells and the Silent Rose. The rain returned in the early morning, as if the sky had suddenly remembered everything that had yet to be said. The drops pattered on the train windows as Hercule Poirot, sitting in a private first-class compartment, watched the world go by like a blurred, moving painting. In front of him, an unopened newspaper. Beside him, his walking stick, perfectly aligned with the edge of the seat. And on his lap, a sealed envelope, with no return address, bearing a foreign stamp that smelled of dried incense. Outside, the French countryside passed in a choreography of greens and ochres, but Poirot's mind wasn't there. His thoughts remained at the Hotel Armitage among dried roses and names never spoken aloud. The compartment door slid open with a slight creak. "May I?" a familiar voice asked, though tinged with travel fatigue. Poirot looked up and, to his surprise, saw his old friend, Captain Arthur Hastings, with greyer hair and a softly aged expression. "My friend," exclaimed Poirot, sitting up with visible joy. "What miracle brings you here?" Hastings smiled and dropped his suitcase into the trunk. "A telegram from you," it said. "If you want to know why a rose can kill, take the 7:14 train." "How can I resist?" Poirot lay back, interlacing his fingers on his chest. "It was an invitation that only you would understand." And I wasn't disappointed, although I was expecting a more conventional murder. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Conventional, you say? A bullet? Poison? No, no, no. What happened at the Armitage was more subtle, more cruel. It was a crime against time itself." Hastings settled in front of him as the train wound slowly along. "Explain yourself, Poirot. I'm beginning to feel I've missed something essential." Poirot took a small leather notebook from his inside jacket pocket and opened it to a page marked with a dried flower. Not a rose, but a lavender petal. "It all started with a flower, mon ami, a flower that wasn't where it should be. Why would anyone send a pressed rose to a woman who doesn't want to be remembered?" "Rosa Le Maire?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly. An actress whose past with a jealous man had turned her into a shadow of herself. A flower as a symbol of memory, yes, but also as a threat. Because the sender didn't want reconciliation. He wanted control, and he got it." Hastings frowned. "And Duvivier, the librarian?" "He was the one who carried out the crime, but not the one who initiated it. Not at least as the mastermind. His desperation was a result of having been displaced. He had also loved, but in silence. And when he felt that silence would be replaced by a stronger memory, he acted. Out of jealousy? Out of fear. The fear that a memory might be more vivid than his own presence. The train slowed as it approached a small, unmarked station. Outside, an empty field and a signal booth. Poirot continued. "Do you remember Countess Varsi? It's impossible to forget her. She had a way of looking at you that made you think she always knew more than she was letting on. And she knew it. But she played at not knowing. Her role in this story wasn't as an accomplice, but as a custodian. She kept the rose. She knew who sent it. She also knew that Rose wasn't ready to know." Hastings looked puzzled. "So why leave her in the room? Why now?" Poirot paused, his face darkened. "Because Rosa was about to get married, and there are those who can't bear to see a memory completely buried. Someone wanted to revive it, to remind her that before a new love, there was one that." ended without end. That flower was a ghost. And do you know who sent it? Poirot smiled sideways. I know, but I won't say it. Because sometimes, my friend, the greatest punishment is knowing you're invisible. The culprit didn't kill with his hands, but he killed with intent. His name will be kept out of the newspapers, out of the statements. He won't be famous. He won't be feared. And that, believe me, will be his personal hell. Hastings looked at him for a long time. Then, almost sadly, he asked, And Rosa, what will she do now? She's going back to France, to her hometown. She told me she might buy a flower shop. Ironic, isn't it? Becoming the caretaker of the thing that almost destroyed her. And you? Will you continue taking trains with hidden mysteries? As long as the grey cells have the strength to organize the disordered, yes. Although I'm starting to think that the deepest enigmas aren't in the crimes, but in the loves that weren't told in time. A friendly silence settled between the two men, like a warm blanket on a cold afternoon. The train picked up speed again. Outside, the fields seemed less grey, as if the world were breathing a little more easily. Poirot took out the envelope he had brought from Armitage. He opened it. Inside, a single folded sheet of paper with firm handwriting. Thank you for not saying my name. Sometimes the cruelest thing is to be remembered. I'd rather disappear. Poirot read it silently. Then he folded the paper and threw it out the window, where the wind melted it as if it had never existed. Anonymous message? Hastings asked. More like a nameless confession. And that, my friend, is the most honest guy of all. The train whistled in the distance, and the mystery of the rose, like so many other important things, dissolved into the landscape without applause or headlines. Only in memory. Chapter 11. The silence in the midnight hall. Midnight filtered through the windows of the Armitage Hotel with the delicacy of an ancient whisper. The walls, covered in crimson velvet and dark paneling, seemed to absorb every step, every breath, every shadow. The lobby was almost empty, except for the receptionist asleep over his registration book and a grandfather clock whose swing marked the rhythm of an invisible weight. Hercule Poirot descended the stairs as if floating. Dressed in his perfectly ironed nightgown and grey velvet slippers, he looked more like a visitor from another century than a guest. His gaze darted back and forth, inspecting details that anyone else would consider banal. A forgotten sheet of music on a chair, a smear of hardened wax next to a candlestick, the slight shift in an oriental rug near the entrance. On a side table, an artificial rose, unlike any other in the hotel, rested in a blue porcelain vase. It smelled of nothing. It had no thorns. Poirot stopped before her. Then, as if this detail had spoken to him in a secret language, he smiled slowly and continued his way toward the music room. The door was ajar. From inside came a faint sound, a piano played by hesitant fingers, as if the player didn't know whether he was rehearsing or remembering. "Good evening, mademoiselle," said Poirot softly as he pushed open the door. Judith Marlowe, still dressed in the coat she had worn earlier, looked up from the piano with a start. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. And yet, here we both are. You with the keys, me with my little grey cells. May I sit down?" She nodded, and Poirot took a nearby armchair, crossing his legs with his usual precision. "Does music help you think, miss?" "Number. But it helps me take my mind off everything else." Poirot inclined his head. "And what about the rest?" Judith stared at the keys. The questions no one dares to ask. The truths hidden behind flowers and unsigned letters. Roses, Poirot murmured, are curious creatures. They symbolize so many things: beauty, pain, memory. Do you know what the rose Rosa Lemaire found symbolized? Judith didn't respond. Instead, her fingers resumed a melody in a minor, a slow, melancholic nocturne. Chopin, perhaps. Poirot waited. He knew that certain silences should not be interrupted. After a minute, Judith spoke. It was sent from Lyon, dated 3 weeks ago. The stamp was from a florist that no longer exists. The address was written in black ink with a shaky hand. And how do you know? Because I was the one who intercepted it before it reached Rosa. I was the one who slipped it into her room that night. Poirot didn't blink. Please continue. I wasn't the one who sent it. But when I saw the envelope among the hotel mail, I knew. I knew something was about to explode. And I decided to prevent it from arriving in a more violent manner. Violent? Rosa had a fragile character. One bad memory was enough to trigger something worse. I wanted her to discover it for herself, at her own pace. Poirot rubbed his moustache. You knew who had sent it. Not for sure, but I suspected it. We all did. In this place, every guest's past floats like old perfume. Poirot slowly stood up and walked to the window. Their reflection in the glass looked like a painting frozen in melancholy. The past doesn't always kill, mademoiselle, but sometimes it whispers until someone acts on its behalf. Judith turned to him. Do you know who it was? I think I know, but there's still one last note missing from this score, a dissonance that doesn't fit. Can I trust you to help me? Always. Poirot nodded, satisfied. He approached the piano and slipped his hand under the lid, taking out a sheet of paper from a hidden compartment. It was folded in 3 and marked with a circular blot of blue ink. Judith turned pale. Where did you find it? In Duvivier's studio, unsigned, but written in the same handwriting as the address on the rose envelope. Judith read it silently. Her lips moved soundlessly. When she finished, she closed her eyes. It's Clarice's, I'm sure. Poirot tilted his head. Countess Vassy. She was Jean Rochefort's lover, the man Rosa left behind, the one who disappeared without explanation. Clarice never forgave him, not for leaving her but for choosing someone else. Poirot sat down again. That explains his coldness, but it doesn't explain the letter. Clarice didn't want Rosa to die, just for her to remember, for her to suffer what she suffered. A symbolic punishment, exact. Poirot stood up, now in a hurry. His footsteps echoed firmly on the polished floor. Thank you, mademoiselle. You've completed the harmony. But there's still one instrument to be tuned. The past can't be redeemed unless it's named. Are you going to compare it? Poirot paused at the door. Number. I'm going to do something crueler. I'm going to understand her and let her face herself. Judith watched him leave with a mixture of admiration and fear. Then she returned to the piano. She played a single note. She let it vibrate, and she understood something she hadn't understood until that night. Sometimes truths shouldn't shout. They should just echo. Next chapter. Shadows on the marble pergola. The shadows of dusk were descending over the gardens of Villegas' house when Poirot requested a walk among the cultivated hedges, asking Madame Ménard to accompany him. The air was mild and humid, scented with old jasmine and irrigated earth. The marble pergola, which ran along one side of the greenhouse, was lined with dried roses still clinging to their stems, the last of the season. Was Miss Clarice fond of flowers? Asked Poirot gently. Madame Ménard, her gloved hands clasped in front of her stomach, seemed to become uncomfortable. A lot, Monsieur Poirot, especially the wilted varieties. He liked to press them, store them among old books. He said live flowers were too noisy. Poirot nodded slowly. And you? Were you close to her? I've worked here since Clarisse was a child. She was reserved, mysterious, but not cruel. Although, lately she seemed restless, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. Weight of conscience? Poirot suggested. Maybe, or memories. She didn't talk much about her past, especially her mother. They passed under an archway covered in dried bougainvillea. A stone bench peeked out between two cracked columns. Poirot stopped. Mrs. Menard, why did you hide the fact that Marianne had returned the week before Clarisse's death? The woman's face twisted. I didn't hide it. I just didn't consider it relevant. Marianne arrived one night, unannounced, as she always did. Clarisse didn't want to see her. She rejected her. But Marianne didn't leave. She stayed at the inn in the village. She didn't return until the morning after the death. Poirot watched her closely. However, no one else seemed to know of his presence during that time. Because I kept it a secret. Clarisse didn't want rumors. And the truth, monsieur, there was a tension between them. Dark, painful, as if they shared something that couldn't be named. Poirot bowed slightly. I appreciate your sincerity. Fear not. The truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how many thorns it must overcome. They returned to the house in silence. Hastings, who had been waiting in the library, stood up as soon as he saw them enter. Any news, Poirot? Several, my friend, but still unformed. The puzzle has extra pieces, or perhaps a crucial piece is still missing. Mrs. Menard, Hastings whispered. Poirot shook his head gently. A loyal woman. But fear, Hastings, makes her selective in her memories. At that moment, the front door opened with a bang. It was Inspector Lefebvre, his face tense. Monsieur Poirot, there's been an incident. Young Etienne tried to hang himself in the gardener's shed. Hang yourself, Hastings exclaimed. Apparently, they found him in time. He's in the hospital, unconscious. There's no note. Just a crumpled letter in his pocket, addressed to Marianne. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. My God, guilt takes many forms. May I see the letter? Lefebvre handed him the envelope. Poirot opened it with care, reading the contents in silence. His brow furrowed slightly. It's not a confession. It's a plea. Etienne was afraid of being accused. He says Marianne had threatened to reveal something if he didn't speak to Clarisse by Wednesday. What kind of threat? Hastings asked. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He went to the window. The moon was just beginning to rise, pale and hazy. We don't know yet, but now it's clear. Marianne was playing a game of her own. Blackmail, perhaps, or revenge, but we weren't wrong. There's a buried history between those sisters. Lefebvre shifted uncomfortably. We've questioned Marianne. She says she never threatened Etienne. She just reminded him that she had unfinished business with Clarisse. Poirot smiled slightly. That, Inspector, is a very useful euphemism. The next morning, Poirot asked everyone present to gather in the green drawing room. Marianne, Madame Menard, Dr. Bertrand, and a new face, the antique dealer, Monsieur Salvat, who had been mentioned earlier as the buyer of some pieces from the family archive. Gentlemen, Poirot began softly, we have reached the moment where the shadows must retreat. Only one crime was apparently committed, but in truth many acts followed one another before Clarisse's death. Everyone fell silent. Marianne, sitting by the unlit fireplace, looked at Poirot with a neutral expression. "We'll start with you, Monsieur Salvat. You received a collection of documents and antiques from Clarisse, didn't you?" The antique dealer nodded. "Yes, manuscripts, letters, even an old edition of poetry with a pressed rose inside." Poirot tilted his head. "Have you sold it yet?" "Number, I kept it. I thought it was odd. It seemed to have more emotional value than financial value." "And did you notice any inscription inside?" "Yes, a handwritten note. Tumachi. Nothing more." Marianne shifted in her seat. Poirot noticed. "The M could be you, madame, or perhaps someone else." No one spoke. Poirot continued. "That pressed rose, gentlemen, is not a romantic symbol. It's an emblem of guilt. It was placed between two pages that tell a poem about betrayal." "What are you implying, Monsieur Poirot?" Bertrand asked tersely. "That someone among you knew a secret too painful to be allowed to blossom, and that secret, after years of being hidden, began to breathe again, and poison." Poirot stopped. "Tonight I'll make my last visit. After that everything will be clear. The lies, the omissions, the half-truths." Marianne looked at him with a slight inclination of her head. "And what do you expect to find on that last visit, Monsieur Poirot?" "Just a door," Poirot replied with a small smile, "one that's been locked for years, and whose key, perhaps, was never thrown into the river." That evening, Poirot went alone to the old archives in the East Wing. Madame Menard was waiting for him with a bunch of keys. "Are you sure you want to come in at this hour, sir? This place is full of dust and memories." "That's precisely why, madame," Poirot replied. "It's in the dust that forgotten truths are hidden." As the key turned in the rusty lock, Poirot felt the past looking in at him, ready to reveal what had remained dormant for so long. Next chapter. The key that opened two lives. The archive lock gave way with a metallic groan, as if protesting the awakening of a carefully cultivated silence. Poirot, his lantern in hand, and his coat tightly buttoned against the ancient chill of the East Wing, crossed the threshold with the caution of one who knows that it is not only dust that rises in closed rooms, but also memories that do not wish to be touched. "Thank you, Madame Menard," he murmured, without looking back at the woman holding the door. She nodded and, obedient to his previous instructions, closed it behind him with a click that sounded more definitive than it should have. The spotlight swept across the shelves, folders with frayed edges, boxes with yellowed labels and torn ribbons, books without titles. The air smelled of damp paper and old wax. In the distance, a motionless figure, a mirror leaning against the wall, partially covered by a stained linen cloth. Poirot didn't look at it yet. He went straight to the corner Monsieur Salvat mentioned, where Clarisse had stored a collection to be sent to the antique dealer. On a creaking wooden table lay several volumes. One was open, revealing a pressed rose that, despite its death, still retained a faint blush. Poirot leaned forward, studying the inscription beneath. 2M. To remind you that you cannot bury what has not died. He stood up slowly. "So guilt doesn't flower, but it doesn't fall either," he muttered. Poirot delicately removed the page and slipped it into an envelope. Then he inspected the rest of the papers. What he was looking for wasn't an object, but an omission. Among so much arranged evidence, something was missing. The letter Clarisse had received the week of her death, mentioned by Madame Menard but never found, nor was the diary of the sister's adoptive mother, supposedly lost after the library was remodeled. It was then that the reflection stopped him. The mirror. Poirot approached, slowly removing the cloth. The glass, clouded by age, barely showed her blurred figure, but on the lower edge, barely visible, was a name: Mariette D. The detective closed his eyes for a moment. Mariette d'Anjou, he whispered. The biological mother. This mirror wasn't an ornament. It was a legacy. He carefully turned the frame. At the back was a false bottom, not sealed with screws, but with a simple wooden wedge. Poirot removed it, and with a sigh, a dark, leather-bound notebook emerged from the frame. Poirot didn't open it yet. He left the archives, taking firm but measured steps, and returned to his room. There, alone, with the lamp lit and silence assured, he began to read. The first pages were Mariette's. Written in a fine, slightly shaky hand, her voice rose from the past. To my daughters, when time deigns to unite the names I separated, I was weak, yes. I gave birth to them in an unforgiving world, and I split my heart in two. Judith was given to the convent in Lyon. I kept Marianne. They never knew each other, but remorse, that invisible gnaw, never left me. When I knew she would die, I left instructions for Clarisse, the only one who knew everything, to reunite them. But she was afraid too. Apparently, silence is contagious. Poirot stopped reading. The weight of the words was denser than any forensic revelation. It wasn't just about separate identities, but about lives structured on the denial of a common origin. Two sisters raised without knowing themselves, and a third figure, Clarisse, who had been given the key to that truth and didn't use it. Poirot returned to the diary. Towards the end, a note was added in a different handwriting. Clarisse's. I committed a crime I wouldn't know how to name. I didn't kill anyone, but I murdered the possibility of reconciliation. When Marianne returned, demanding the truth, I lied to her. I said Judith had died of a fever years ago, but it wasn't true. I couldn't bear to see them together. There was something, too strong, too like a broken mirror threatening to rebuild itself. I preferred to keep them apart, until Marianne discovered the diary. Then everything changed. Poirot leaned back in his chair. Donc, Clarisse feared the union of the sisters more than death itself. The rest of the diary included a recently dated note, a few hastily written lines indicating a meeting with Etienne. Apparently, Clarisse had decided to confess the truth, but not to Marianne. Through Etienne, her confidant. Poirot thought about the young man's suicide attempt. It wasn't guilt, it was despair. He knew something, and he feared it would be misinterpreted. And so, everything began to fall into place. Marianne returned with suspicions. Clarisse, cornered, decided to protect the lie that had sustained her. But someone else entered the fray. Someone who wanted to reveal the past, not for redemption, but for a break. Could it be Judith? Number Judith, by all accounts, kept to herself, busy with her research. And yet, Poirot returned to the envelope containing the page with the pressed rose. He looked at the handwriting, and then he compared it with the handwriting in Clarisse's diary. They didn't match. It was a third hand, thin but tilted to the left, with short, precise strokes. Someone who had wanted to send a message, not to Clarisse, but to Marianne. A third actor, a third will. Poirot jumped up. Hastings! The captain entered the room instantly. What's going on? I need you to find something for me. There should be a file on Judith D. in the archives at the Lyon convent, but look carefully. It could be under another name. What kind of name? One that was never spoken out loud, one that begins with M. Hastings paled. Are you implying that? Poirot looked at him gravely. We've assumed too much. Clarisse was the one who knew everything, but who told us Judith never came back? A silence settled between them. Go, my friend, before the person who wove this web closes the circle. Poirot looked back at the diary. He closed it gently, as if saying goodbye to a voice, and placed it in his briefcase. This time the pieces didn't just fit together. They began to point to a figure that, until now, had remained behind the mirror. Next chapter, a woman with another name. The next morning, while the mist still hung over the convent gardens like a damp sheet, Poirot descended into the dining room without his usual meticulous composure. His tie was slightly askew, and although no one else would have noticed, Hastings frowned instantly. "You haven't slept," said the captain, placing the cup back on the saucer with a slight clink. Poirot nodded without looking up from his notebook. "Sleep is an indulgence that sometimes interferes with the precision of the truth, mon ami. And the truth spoke to you during the night?" "Number." "But he started looking in my direction, and I suspect he doesn't like what he sees." Hastings bowed slightly. "I've sent the request to Lyon as you requested. It won't be easy to access those archives. Religious orders are very jealous of their records. That's why we should be more patient than them, and more persistent." Poirot closed his notebook with a snap. "But there's something we can do in the meantime." "What thing?" "Visit the only person who might be able to confirm such a delicate suspicion, Madame Élodie Martineau." "The housekeeper?" "Yes, but also the only one who's served here since before Judith left, and who's seen all three women, Clarisse, Marianne, and perhaps a third, with a very similar face, but a name that wasn't hers. Élodie welcomed them into the pantry, surrounded by jars of ancient spices and sacks of flour that seemed to hold decades of silence. She wiped her hands on her apron and offered them a seat with a stiff but not hostile gesture. "Do you want coffee?" "Only your memories, madame," said Poirot gently. She smiled bitterly. "Mine are as bitter as coffee without sugar, Monsieur Poirot. But if you think they serve your purpose, go ahead." "Do you remember Judith D?" "Perfectly. She was a quiet, serious young woman. She always had books in her hand. She rarely smiled, but when she did, you felt like you'd gained something." "And did you ever see her return?" "Never. At least, not with that name." Poirot inclined his head. "And with another one?" Élodie placed her hand on her chest, hesitant. Then she stood up, went to a small drawer, and took out a worn photograph. "This picture was taken 3 years ago, during the convent's 150th anniversary celebration. Clarisse insisted on inviting former residents. This woman," she pointed to a barely visible profile figure in the background, "said her name was Madeleine d'Orsay, but I didn't believe a word of it." Poirot studied the photograph with a magnifying glass. The profile was faint, but there was something in the posture, in the way she held the crystal glass, that matched the only image he had of Judith. An oil painting in Clarisse's study. Could it be Judith by another name? I could. And if I may say so, Clarisse was very upset when she saw her. Poirot nodded, murmuring, "Because he knew it immediately." He put the photograph away and said goodbye to Élodie with an almost reverential bow. Whether it was her answers or her grief, he had given something precious. Back in the study Poirot was temporarily occupying, they sat opposite each other. Poirot spread Mariette's diary out on the table, placed the photograph beside it, and placed a dried flower between them. Not the pressed rose, but a new one, a withered gardenia he had found under the windowsill in the west wing. Clarice said she hated gardenias, Hastings murmured, that they reminded her of something unpleasant. Poirot nodded. And yet, someone placed one right where Clarice used to read in the evenings, someone who knew, someone who wanted to provoke. Hastings looked at him with growing unease. Are you suggesting that Judith, or Madeline, if that's her new name, returned not for reconciliation but for revenge? No, Hastings, not revenge. Yet. But for a truth that Clarice tried so hard to bury that she ended up being the first victim of her own silence. There was a tense silence. Poirot opened the diary to the last page and read aloud. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror I inherited from my mother, I see a face that isn't my own. Not because I don't recognize myself, but because I feel someone else should be there. Hastings swallowed. That's creepy. That's what happens when an identity is stolen for years. The mirror stops reflecting and starts accusing. Poirot got up and went to the window. We have 3 names, Judith D., Madeleine d'Orsay, and Marianne, and we have 3 symbols, a pressed rose, a hidden mirror, and a withered gardenia. The past isn't trying to return. It's trying to correct itself. Hastings approached the table. So, what's next? Poirot looked at the convent garden. A figure was crossing the path, wrapped in a light coat, holding a closed parasol despite the overcast sky. We're going to have to talk to Marianne, he said firmly. Not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as someone who may have remembered more than she's letting on, and who, perhaps, is also waiting for Judith to return with a name she doesn't recognize, but with a pain she does. That afternoon, Marianne welcomed them in the music room. Her fingers were still on the piano keys when Poirot entered. I like to think this instrument remembers what you don't want to say, she commented without turning around. Poirot smiled. And I think sometimes he says what one doesn't remember having felt. Marianne slowly lowered her hands. To what do I owe the honor this time? A coincidence, or perhaps a photograph. Mrs. Martineau still has one from the commemoration 3 years ago. Do you remember that occasion? Marianne nodded curtly. It was a long day. Clarice was in a bad mood. Did you recognize anyone? Marianne hesitated for only a second. Not that I know of. Poirot placed the photograph on the table. This woman. Have you seen her before? Marianne looked at her. She said nothing for several long seconds. Then, very softly, as if speaking to a shadow only she could see. My mother had a sister, but I was told she died when she was little. Poirot approached. Who told you? Clarice, always Clarice. Poirot crouched down to eye level. Mademoiselle, that woman came seeking something, perhaps not revenge. Perhaps only the recognition of a name denied her. And if you remember anything else, any gesture, any letter, any melody even, this is the moment. Marianne looked down. From her skirt, she pulled out a sheet of music. It wasn't hers. I found it in the Hall of Mirrors after Clarice's death, an unfinished melody, signed with a single initial. J. Poirot took the sheet of paper. The notes were simple, almost childlike, but there was something in the cadence that spoke of an ancient loss. Thank you, he said. As they left the room, Poirot whispered to Hastings, We're not chasing a woman anymore. We're chasing a wound that's learned to hide behind many names. And somewhere, the woman who had been Judith or Madeline was leaving clues not to be discovered, but to be remembered. Next chapter. The painting that changed places. Night descended upon the convent with the same heaviness it had fallen upon Poirot's soul. In his room, in front of the oil lamp that flickered from time to time as if doubting its very existence, the Belgian detective silently reviewed each collected fragment, names, flowers, musical notes, and glances that spoke with the weight of what could not be said. Judith, Madeleine, Marianne. 3 names, 3 versions of the same tarnished mirror. But there was still one reflection missing, one that Clarisse had tried to erase from every corner of this place. And yet, like all silenced truths, it persisted. Poirot leaned toward the table where the music sheet signed J lay. Beside it, a withered gardenia flower. And in front of them, the profile photograph of the woman Clarisse pretended not to recognize. "There's one detail," he murmured to himself. "Something we haven't seen clearly enough." It was then that someone knocked softly on the door. Hastings entered, breathless, his face agitated. "Poirot, you have to see this." She led him down the east wing corridor to the small prayer room adjoining the library. The door was ajar, and there, on the north wall, hung a painting. Poirot narrowed his eyes. It wasn't new. It was a portrait of a young woman sitting in a garden, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze absent, and a bouquet of white roses at her feet. He'd seen it before, but not here. "Where was this painting yesterday?" he asked in a low voice. "In the archive attic, wrapped in sheets," Hastings replied. "I saw him myself when Sister Mireille and I went through the old trunks." "And who brought him here?" "Nobody knows, or so they say." Poirot approached the canvas, the signature in the lower corner, C.D. Clarisse d'Amboise. But that wasn't what worried him. It was the woman in the portrait. Her face had an expression suspended in an endless moment. And it wasn't Marianne, nor Clarisse. But it wasn't a complete stranger either. It was a mixture of all 3. As if the brush had captured an essence that couldn't be confined to a single name. "Could that be Judith?" Hastings murmured. Poirot nodded slowly. "Or Judith's idea, painted by Clarisse not as she was, but as she feared she would become." Later that evening, Poirot asked to speak to Sister Mireille, the librarian. She was a small woman with silver hair, a direct gaze, and quiet steps. She entered the living room where he was waiting for her with his arms crossed, as if he were dreading what he was about to ask. "Do you recognize this painting?" asked Poirot, pointing to a reproduction he had copied from the original. She watched him for a moment. Then she nodded. "It used to hang in Clarisse's private room, until she put it away years ago. She said she didn't want to see that face anymore. Because I dreamed it," Mireille whispered. "Because every time I saw it I remembered the day Judith disappeared, and I was afraid that one day that portrait would open its eyes." Poirot straightened up. "And you? What do you think that painting represents?" The nun hesitated. Then she spoke in a trembling voice. "I think it's an attempt to enclose a memory in a frame. But memories, Monsieur Poirot, they don't accept enclosures." The next day, Marianne asked to see Poirot. She was visibly upset. She had found a letter in an old Bible that had belonged to Clarisse. "It's not signed," he said, "but judging by the handwriting, it's obviously my mother who wrote it, or whoever claimed to be my mother." Poirot took it carefully. The paper was fragile, the ink faded. "If you ever return, don't go near the rose. She doesn't know you're you yet. And if she did, she might wither before she forgives herself." Poirot read it 3 times. "Who is she?" Marianne asked. "It could be you, or Judith, or both of you, or a third entity made of the fear between you 2. Marianne closed her eyes. "There's something else. When I was a child, Clarisse forbade me from looking at certain paintings. She said they weren't for my eyes. One of them was this one. Because I knew that sooner or later you would see something that didn't fit, said Poirot. And what doesn't fit? Poirot looked at the portrait once more. Then he took a magnifying glass and examined the vase of white roses at the feet of the painted figure. A rose has one more petal, he whispered. Sorry, all the roses in the bouquet have 5 petals, except one. It has 6. Clarisse would never have made a botanical error. Not on such a personal painting. This isn't a mistake. It's a trademark. Marianne looked at him pale. A sign. Oui. A hidden symbol. Perhaps the only way Clarisse found to say something she never dared to utter. Poirot jumped up. We have to go back to the mirror room. The mirror room, uninhabited since Clarisse's death, had the suspended air of a place waiting for a final word. The portrait hung again on the east wall, as if it had never been moved. But this time, Poirot didn't approach it. He went straight to the floor. With his cane, he began to tap lightly on the boards, once, twice, until, beneath the 3rd row, something rattled hollowly. Hastings, he said, without turning around, I need a flathead screwdriver, or a sturdy spoon. With effort, they lifted the board. Beneath it, wrapped in a blue cloth, lay a metal box. Rusty, closed with a simple buckle. Marianne covered her mouth. Poirot delicately opened the box. Inside, there was a handkerchief embroidered with the initials J.D., a photograph of 2 identical girls, holding hands, back to back, looking at a lake. A sheet of paper torn from a music notebook with the same incomplete melody they already knew, this time written down in red ink. And a letter, sealed. Poirot lifted her up. This is what Clarisse wanted to hide, not just a name, but a decision. He looked at Marianne. Do you want to open it? She trembled, but she nodded. Poirot handed her the letter. Marianne broke the seal. He read in silence, for long minutes. When he finished, his face was no longer the same. What does it say? Hastings asked carefully. Marianne folded the paper. That Judith never left. That Clarisse changed her name. That I am the daughter of both of them. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Both? Clarisse and Judith were sisters. One adopted, the other ran away. One raised, the other watched, but neither dared to tell me. Poirot nodded. Because if I did, the painting would break, and on the other side of the frame, there's always a reflection more painful than the original. Leaving the Hall of Mirrors, Poirot stopped in front of the portrait. For the first time, the woman in the painting seemed to be looking at him, and he, raising a finger, said in a barely audible voice, Mademoiselle Judith, perhaps you will find rest now. Next chapter, The Rose Under the Flame. The silence in the abbey had been transformed. It was number. Longer the pious stillness of contemplation, but a suspended tension, like the final note of a symphony that still didn't know whether to dissolve into applause or tears. Since the discovery of the letter and the box under the floor of the mirror room, Marianne no longer walked with the uncertain lightness of someone searching for her roots, but with the heavy gravity of someone who has found them, and fears what will blossom when she waters them. Poirot, for his part, maintained his usual composure, but even he seemed more thoughtful, less meticulous in the way he folded his handkerchief or adjusted his shirt cuffs. There was a shadow in his eyes, one that came not from the unknown, but from truth itself. Hastings, mon ami, he said softly as they walked along the side garden, what does one do with a truth that comes too late? Too late for what? Hastings asked, genuinely confused. Too late for a change of heart, Too late for the one who was meant to hear it in life to be saved. Look around. Poirot indicated the aging walls, the orange trees in bloom, the still fountain. This convent is full of secrets, and like any structure that harbors silence for too long, it begins to creak. At that moment, Marianne approached. Her face was pale but steady. She held the handkerchief embroidered with the initials J.D., now clean and lovingly ironed, as if it were a relic that had finally found its altar. "Monsieur Poirot," she said calmly, "there is something I still don't understand. If Judith was Clarice's sister, why hide everything from me? Why such meticulous cruelty?" "It wasn't cruelty," Poirot corrected gently. "It was cowardice, déguisé avec noblesse, disguised as virtue. Clarice convinced herself that protecting her from the past was an act of love. But perhaps," he added, looking at the handkerchief, "what she did was amputate one half of her truth to save the other, and that, mademoiselle, is something that always ends up hurting later." Marianne looked down. "I don't remember anything about Judith." "That doesn't mean she didn't leave traces," said Poirot. "Sometimes memory hides in places you don't think to look." That afternoon, as a light rain began to fog the chapel's stained glass windows, Hastings returned with a curious find. "Poirot, I think you should see this." He was holding a piece of sheet music, not a copy like the previous ones, an original with ink stains, small pencil corrections, and a handwritten title in the top margin. "Song for Marianne, Compo de dos Madres." Poirot took it delicately. It was the same incomplete melody they'd heard, but this time it reached its end. And in the last bar, a trill in C minor that seemed to hang in the air, like a sustained farewell. "Where did you find it?" asked Poirot, without taking his eyes off the sheet of paper. "In the South confessional. It was folded inside an old missal, as if someone had left it there. Years ago." "Or last night," said Poirot, his eyes blazing. "Last night." The painting shifted. The box appeared under the floor. And now this. Someone doesn't want this story to remain half-written. He then decided it was time to talk to the one person who hadn't said a word since Clarice's death, the Mother Superior. Sister Agathe was a slender figure, with a straight back and few words. She lived in an austere cell, unadorned except for a carved wooden crucifix and a small Madonna with a face eroded by age. Poirot was greeted with a look that neither questioned nor conceded. It merely waited. "Sister Agathe," he began respectfully, "do you know who moved the painting? Or who left this score?" She didn't respond immediately. She just slowly smoothed the blanket over her lap. "When a candle is about to burn out," she said finally, "sometimes it burns brightest in its last breath." Clarice knew her time was running out, and she began to undo the knots she had woven for decades. "Including Judith's?" The Mother Superior looked up, her eyes wells of memories she didn't want to reveal. "I'm not authorized to break the seal of what was confessed, but I can tell you this. Not all the sisters in this convent came by faith. Some came by guilt." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Are you saying Judith never left?" "I say there are many ways to hide, and that sometimes a woman changes so much that she no longer remembers who she was." That night, Poirot locked himself in the library. For hours he pored over books, sheet music, and unsigned letters. He compared handwriting, dates, and postage stamps. Everything pointed to one possibility. The next morning, he summoned Marianne, Hastings, and the Mother Superior to the picture room. The portrait still hung in its place, majestic and enigmatic, But now Poirot had a mirror hung beside it. "The past," he began, "is a mirror that always distorts what it hides. And when it's held up to a portrait, it reveals what the painter was afraid to see." He turned to Marianne. "Mademoiselle, you said you didn't remember Judith, but perhaps her memory isn't hidden in images, but in sounds." He took out the final score. He placed it on the piano in the corner, and with trembling fingers, Poirot played the melody. 1, 2, 3 notes, until, as the final beat arrived, a shadow appeared in the doorway, a thin figure in a grey robe, with breezy footsteps. "Enough," said a soft voice, broken by years of silence. Everyone turned around. It was Sister Blanche, always silent, always absent from everyday affairs. A shadow among shadows. "That song. I wrote it," he said, leaning closer, "but not for Marianne, for me, so I wouldn't forget who I was, before they called me by another name." Poirot nodded, without surprise. "Judith." She smiled. Not with joy, but with relief, like someone finally letting go of a stone they've been carrying in their heart. "I was Clarisse's sister, the youngest, the one who ran away, the one who came back, but by the time I came back it was too late. Clarisse had made up a story, and I agreed to be part of it, because seeing her happy with the baby was more important than anything else." Marianne stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "And he never wanted to tell me?" "I wanted to, many times. But every time I got closer, I saw the fear in Clarisse's eyes, and I pulled away. I thought that in time, love would be enough." Poirot lowered his head. "But love without truth is like a rose without roots." Judith looked at Marianne. "Forgive me, not for leaving, but for not coming back in time." Marianne came over. She hugged her without saying anything. The painting on the wall seemed lighter, as if, finally, I could breathe too. Final chapter. The silence of the second voice. The Abbey seemed different that morning. It wasn't that the sun was shining brighter or the birds were singing in a special way, but something imperceptible had changed. A weight had been lifted from the walls, as if the walls themselves were breathing more freely. However, for Hercule Poirot, the case was not yet solved, not quite. Marianne, Judith, the Mother Superior, and Hastings gathered in the library, summoned by the detective. On the central table lay the oak case, the complete score, and the handkerchief bearing the initials J.D. neatly folded. Poirot, erect and serene, regarded them with an expression that was not one of triumph, but of conclusion. "My friends," he began, gently placing his fingertips on the box, "we have unearthed truths hidden beneath layers of silence, shame, and sacrifice. We have identified Judith, the missing mother. We have understood Clarisse's fear. But there is still one last shadow to be cleared." Judith looked up nervously. "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" "I mean, there's a difference between a confession and a resolution. You have confessed to being Judith, and Mademoiselle Marianne has nobly accepted that truth. But we still don't know exactly what motivated Clarisse's death." Everyone fell silent. Up to that point, the shared theory was clear. Clarisse had died of natural causes, her body overcome by accumulated stress and the underlying illness. But Poirot's look suggested otherwise. "When I examined your room," he continued, "I found a blue china cup, slightly out of place. It contained traces of linden and valerian, but also a bitterness that didn't correspond to those herbs." "Poison?" Hastings whispered. Poirot nodded. "Digitoxin, a compound derived from digitalis, lethal in cumulative doses, undetectable if administered slowly." "Are you suggesting—" "Murder?" Marianne asked, her eyes wide. "Non, mademoiselle. I'm stating that your adoptive mother was poisoned." The silence thickened. Judith covered her mouth, horrified. "Who?" Poirot turned slowly towards the only figure that showed no surprise. The Mother Superior. "Sister Agathe," he said in a grave but respectful tone. "You knew Clarisse wouldn't resist an exposed truth. Her authority, her history, her role within the convent. Were you the one who offered her the infusion that night?" Agathe held her gaze. Her eyes, for the first time, showed something more than composure, resignation. "I didn't do it out of hate," he finally said. "I did it out of fear." "What were you afraid of?" "That the convent would crumble under the weight of an unredeemed past." Clarisse had built a fragile structure based on a mission. When her health began to decline, she asked me for help to die quietly. I obeyed her, as I always have. "Was it an act of mercy or institutional preservation?" Poirot asked harshly. The Mother Superior lowered her eyes. "It was both." Judith stood up. "And the truth? Didn't Clarisse deserve to die knowing her daughter had forgiven her?" "Maybe," Agatha murmured, "but some women aren't born to be forgiven. They're born to endure everything until they can't anymore." Poirot walked to the window. He looked out over the gardens and the overcast sky. "Forgiveness, sister, is not a burden. It's a noble surrender. You chose to maintain order at the cost of compassion. But structures without compassion always collapse." The Mother Superior didn't reply. She just nodded slowly. "I'll do the right thing. I'll confess to the civil authorities." "That would be the wisest thing to do," said Poirot, without judgment in his voice. Days later, the Abbey was a different place. The gates of the entrance remained open during the day. The sisters, previously wrapped in hermetic routines, had begun to spend more time together in the garden, in music, in conversation, as if the secret finally revealed had also opened other cracks, brighter ones. Judith had decided to stay, but no longer as a nameless shadow. She resumed using her given name and asked to remain at the convent, not as penance, but as a free choice. Marianne, for her part, announced that she was leaving the Abbey, not out of anger or escape, but to compose. The unfinished score was now hers. She wanted to finish it somewhere where the notes would resonate without guilt. Before leaving, Poirot and Hastings paused before the painting in the West Wing. Clarisse's figure, so solemn, so rigid in the oil painting, now seemed more human. "You know, Hastings," said Poirot, adjusting his hat, "there are crimes of blood and there are crimes of silence. Both leave traces. But the latter, they usually take longer to solve. Do you think Marianne can heal all of this?" "I don't know," Poirot replied, "but I know it contains a truth it didn't have before, and a truth spoken in time. It can be music." He turned towards the door. "Come on, mon ami. This case is over, and there are still many portraits that hide other stories.